Thanks very much for the opportunity to contribute a few remarks at the outset of this panel. I'm incredibly sorry I can't be there in person, but I am very confident that Brandon will represent CISA superbly as he always does, and certainly as the acting director during our agency's response to the solar wind supply chain compromise, he will have much of value to contribute to this discussion. Now, since I only have about 10 minutes, and since only Brandon will have to answer for my remarks, I did want to zoom out a bit and start with some historical context, starting with today's date, May 11th. A few points of note. On this day in 1951, engineer J. Forrester applied for a patent for computer core memory, giving birth to RAM. On this day in 1981, Andrew Lloyd Webber's musical Cats premiered in London's West End. On this day in 1987, surgeons at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore performed the first heart transplant operation from a live donor. And on this day in 1997, IBM's supercomputer, Deep Blue, defeated chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov at a tournament in New York City. Oh, and perhaps the most important thing that happened on this day, in 1969, British comedy troupe Monty Python was formed. So you might be asking yourself, where is she going with this? And you might even be saying, no one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Well, humor aside, I would note that all of those events have at least one important thing in common. They would not be possible without imagination. And while much of the discourse of this conference will rightly be about the urgent issues of the day, to include how we must collaborate to ensure secure and resilient global supply chains, I think it's equally critical to focus on the overriding values that must underpin our collective cyber defense over the next decade. Among these, I would include the power of imagination. And those of you who know me know this is a common theme for me, even a little bit of an obsession, going back to a different 11th. It wasn't May 11th, but rather September 11th, 8 months and 2 decades ago, when America suffered the most significant terrorist attack on US soil, resulting in the deaths of 2,977 people from over 90 countries around the world. I was at West Point on September 11, 2001, preparing to teach national security to cadets whose worlds were changed in an instant with a recognition that combat was likely in their near future. And just a few short years later, I found myself sitting behind my then boss, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, as she testified in front of the 9/11 Commission. I vividly recall the words of 9/11 co-chairman Tom Kane ringing in my ears even to this day. He said, on that September day, we were unprepared. We did not grasp the magnitude of a threat that had been growing for some considerable amount of time. This was a failure of policing, a failure of management, a failure of capability, but above all, a failure of imagination. We together would do well to heed these words and remember that while history may not repeat itself, it surely does rhyme. We cannot afford to suffer another colossal failure of imagination, and the stakes in the decade ahead could not be any higher, particularly for those of us in technology and cybersecurity. The balance of power in global governance and even the future of global economic competitiveness will all be significantly shaped in the immediate future. And at the core of this competition, I would argue, is technological innovation. Who will create the key technologies of the future? Who will make the rules for their use, ensuring fairness and equity and access by design? Who will ensure that they are secure? And who will train and retain the talent that will supercharge innovation for decades and centuries to come? The nation, or the club of nations that drives the most technological innovation, will, I would argue, hold a competitive edge that will impact every dimension of global society. Einstein famously noted that imagination is more important than knowledge. And that's something that I've witnessed and experienced firsthand throughout my career, to include when I was in the Army and I served in Iraq in 2007. With terrorist violence at an all-time high, my team and I were deployed from the National Security Agency. charged with operationalizing a new high-technology platform known as Real-Time Regional Gateway, or RTRG. And it was a system designed to take all of our collection in theater and enrich it and correlate it and integrate it so that we could illuminate terrorist bomb-making networks, not in weeks or days, but in hours or minutes, and provide that intel into the hands of the operators so they could disrupt those networks. Now, sitting in the van in the middle of a base in Baghdad, our team was working to write the code to make that system run. And during that time, there were many, many small failures, but there was no failure of imagination. Indeed, there was a palpable presence of it. It was an environment of experimentation and collaboration and entrepreneurship. And within weeks, we were able to provide a technology that would later be credited with taking thousands of terrorists off the battlefield and saving the lives of Iraqi civilians and coalition troops. And this experience was really an epiphany to me, personally, about the power of technology and imagination that when used together could produce incredible results and save lives. Now, as I said, that was 2007, and in retrospect, I've been struck by the other technological breakthroughs that occurred that same year. 2007, of course, was the year that Steve Jobs introduced the world to the first iPhone, sparking a revolution in communications technology that has changed the way we all live and work. It was the same year that a small microblogging platform called Twitter began to spin off and scale globally, following in the footsteps of Facebook, which had just recently become available to anyone over the age of 13 with a valid email address. 2007 was the same year that development began on GitHub, the year that Hadoop emerged, the year Google launched Android and Amazon launched Kindle. It was the year that Intel first introduced non-silicon material into microchips, which enabled the continued delivery, at least for the time, of exponential growth in computing power as predicted by Gordon Moore in 1965. Now, perhaps most strikingly, 2007 was just 15 years ago. Think of how much has changed in our world as a result of these capabilities, which sprang from the imagination of some of our nation's most talented entrepreneurs. And what have we learned about the power and the misuse of technology during that time? And how will it inform the next 10 years and beyond? The emerging technology of today will define the shape of the world tomorrow. And it's not an exaggeration, in my view, to assert that the next 10 years could truly determine whether the liberal world order of the post-World War II period will survive. Or more optimistically, whether we as like-minded democratic nations will continue to thrive. Now, just imagine some of our biggest challenges. Will we learn the lessons of the march to 5G telecommunications by investing early in emerging technologies that are foundational to our future? Or will we cede to a reality in which authoritarian, regime-linked firms become the center of gravity for innovating connectivity, setting global standards, patenting their tech, and progressively setting the telecom agenda of the future? Will we together define how powerful and yes, potentially dangerous technologies like facial recognition are developed and deployed? Or will we allow regimes with a penchant for using these technologies in anti-democratic ways set the rules? Will we be the first to develop a cryptographically relevant quantum computer, or are we going to lose a race that could threaten to unravel some of our most sensitive information? Will we develop and unleash the power of artificial intelligence for good, spotting pathogens in blood samples, helping to predict emergencies before they happen? Or will we defer to governments that use these algorithms to develop things like social credit scores and manipulate information flow? Will we develop and effectively reclaim the promise of a single global internet, one that is truly open and fosters competition and privacy and respect for human rights? Or are we truly doomed to manage an increasingly balkanized internet ecosystem in which millions or even billions of people are unable to communicate freely in a global commons? Will we lead on the development of smart tech and the growth of smart cities in a way that is not just secure by design, but engineered for privacy by design? Will we work together, finally, to lead the effort to shape the tech ecosystem to ensure that our software and our systems and our networks, and yes, the supply chains that underpin it all, are secure and resilient by design so that a decade from now, a major intrusion or a new severe zero-day vulnerability is the exception, not the norm? The answer to all of these questions can be, indeed, they must be yes. But only if we invest aggressively in our alliances, in our people, in global standards that reflect the core values that we hold dear across our nations and that bind us together. And it's why conferences like CyberUK, and more importantly, the conversations and the connections made here and the ideas discussed and debated here are so vital to our ability to imagine and reimagine and make real the collective cyber defense of our planet. Thanks again for the opportunity.